Don't sign that contract. He's lying to you. Every word he just translated will destroy you.
She was hired to clean the room after the deal. Instead, she stopped at 5 seconds before the signature. Here's the thing about being invisible. People say things around you they would never say if they thought you were actually listening. They forget you're there. And when you understand both languages being spoken in a room and the translator starts lying, well, you have a choice to make. Clare Johnson made hers. And nobody in that room, not the Mafia boss, not the foreign investors, not the traitors standing between them, was ready for it. Gloved hands, dark uniform, a methodical rhythm of surfaces cleaned and corners attended to. Her presence was designed to register as furniture, necessary, unremarkable, beneath notice. She had spent 2 years learning how to disappear inside rooms like this one, how to reduce herself to motion, how to make herself a ghost that left no trace except clean glass and an undisturbed floor. She was exceptionally good at it. At the head of the long steel table sat Jiho, a man whose stillness was not peace but pressure. His face was a controlled mask, placid in the way that predators are placid when they do not yet need to move. His hands rested near a closed leather contract folder, and beside his right hand, a pen lay waiting. He was not a man who showed fear. He was, by every account that had ever circulated in the rooms Clare once inhabited, a man other men showed fear to. Across from him, 2 foreign investors moved with the easy comfort of people who believed they held the superior position, smiling where Jiho did not smile, nodding where he remained still. They had flown in from 3 time zones away. They believed they were taming something. Between them stood Jae-young. Polished, composed, the kind of handsome that comes not from genetics, but from discipline, the face of a man who has learned exactly how to look trustworthy. His voice was smooth and well-modulated, moving between Korean and English with the kind of effortless fluency that made people lean in rather than check. He was the bridge between worlds, the translator, the trusted intermediary, the man both sides had handed the keys to. And Clare, moving at the periphery, wiping a glass panel she had already wiped once, heard every word he said. In both languages. She had been a corporate risk analyst for 11 years before the world she'd built was methodically taken apart around her. She had drafted contract clauses in 3 jurisdictions. She had negotiated terms across 4 languages, Korean among them, a skill she had acquired not for prestige, but because language, she had learned early, was where truth hid. In the space between what was said and what was meant, fortunes were made and destroyed. She understood what Jae-young was doing before she fully understood that she was watching it happen. It started small, a conditional phrase where an absolute had been spoken. The word shall, Jiho's word, delivered in Korean with the firmness of a closed door, rendered in English as may. A single syllable of difference. An ocean of legal consequence. Claire's hand slowed on the glass. Then came the second deviation. Jiho stated a liability clause, absolute, non-negotiable, the kind of language that meant, this is the wall. Jae-young turned to the investors and smiled reassuringly, his English smooth as water over stone, and told them that Jiho was open to reviewing the terms pending their proposed amendments. He had not said that. He had said the opposite. He had said never. The clink of Claire's cleaning tool against the glass panel was the only sound that betrayed her. A small, involuntary thing. A body's honest response when the mind tries to stay composed under the weight of something it has just recognized. She knew this methodology. She had watched it used on her. A different room, different players, the same architecture of surgical, elegant deception. Not the blunt fraud of amateurs. The refined dismantling of a professional. Jae-young was not making mistakes. He was making choices. Every altered word was intentional. Every softened clause a step in a construction project no one else in the room could see. Jiho was not being negotiated with. He was being led. And the contract waiting for his signature was not a deal. It was a leash. The weight of what she knew pressed behind her eyes. Clare retreated toward the back of the room under the pretext of collecting her supply caddy, putting steel at her back and glass between herself and the table. In that narrow margin of space, reality came down on her with its full, unmerciful weight. She had assembled this life with careful, deliberate hands. The night shifts, the anonymity, the uniform that let her exist in rooms like this one without being seen. It had cost her everything she'd once been, and in exchange it had given her the one thing she needed more than any title or salary: safety. To intervene was to shatter it. To stay silent was to become part of what was happening. Her father had been a structural engineer, a man who built things meant to hold weight. His philosophy was simple and uncompromising. A structure with a compromised joint doesn't fail slowly. It fails completely, and it takes everything standing on it down with it. He had died watching that principle applied to his own life by people who shared Jae-young's confidence and complete absence of conscience. Claire looked at Ji-ho. A powerful man, a dangerous man, a man who, in this moment, did not know he was being handed a document designed to systematically transfer the ownership of his entire empire into hands that had no intention of ever returning it. She looked at Jae-young, the trusted bridge, the compromised joint, and she looked at the pen. Ji-ho reached for it. The building at night was a different organism than the building by day. By day, it was all motion and assertion, executives with voices pitched to carry, assistants moving like satellites in fixed orbits, the hum of consequence. Claire had learned its geography across 4 months of night shifts, which corridors held sound, which glass panels were two-way, which rooms were cleaned before occupancy, and which were cleaned after. The negotiation suites on the 14th floor were the latter. You did not enter until the principals were gone, until the last traces of whatever had happened inside had settled into stillness. Tonight was an exception. The facility manager had flagged it as a special session: late start, extended duration, full discretion required. The team had been told to clean around the active room rather than wait for it. Stay peripheral. Stay invisible. Don't make eye contact with the principals. Treat it like a sealed environment. Claire had noted this briefing with the particular attention she gave to everything that told her what she wasn't supposed to see. She arrived at 9:47 p.m. The corridor outside the main negotiation chamber was lit at half intensity, a deliberate environmental choice meant to communicate the gravity of whatever was happening inside. Through the glass panels that formed the outer wall of Suite 14A, she could see the room configured for a high-stakes session. The long table centered under focused overhead lighting, the chairs arranged with precise intention, water glasses filled and untouched, a leather-bound document portfolio at one position. At the head of the table, Ji-ho Lim. She recognized him the way you recognize a weather pattern, not by name at first, but by what his presence did to the atmosphere around him. He was not the largest man in the room. He was not the loudest. He was, in fact, conspicuously still, seated with his hands resting flat on the table in a posture that read less like patience and more like controlled pressure. Men like Ji-ho did not fidget. They did not fill silence. They occupied it the way a weight occupies a scale. He was, she would later confirm from a fragment of overheard introduction, the head of the Lim Group, a constellation of Korean enterprises that operated with legal legitimacy at its surface, and something considerably more complex beneath it. The kind of organization whose name appeared in diplomatic conversations alongside careful pauses. Claire had encountered references to it in her previous life, not from her own work, but in the periphery of a due diligence file she had once been handed and then, very deliberately, told to return. She had returned it. That had been one of several decisions she would later understand as catastrophic mistakes in the direction of compliance. She began her work on the outer corridor, moving slowly, keeping her body language entirely ordinary. Cleaner. Floor. Task. She was a woman who had learned, in the hardest possible way, that the performance of unremarkability was its own kind of skill. Inside Suite 14A, the other parties arrived in staggered intervals. 2 men she didn't recognize, American by the cut of their suits and the quality of their ease, settled across from Ji-ho with the body language of people who had been told this meeting was already won. Behind them, a pair of legal observers took positions at the wall, silent, attentive, carrying tablets and the expressions of people paid to watch rather than speak. And then Jae-young. He entered last, which Claire would later understand as a choice rather than tardiness. He carried a slim leather portfolio and moved to a standing position between the two sides of the table, the classic positioning of a mediator, a bridge, the figure both sides were meant to look toward when they needed the other to be translated. He was, by every visible signal, precisely what he presented himself as: trustworthy, competent, essential. Claire moved her caddy 12 feet down the corridor. Then another 6. The glass paneling that formed the outer wall of the suite was thick, sound-dampening, the building specs would say, but not entirely impermeable. There was a ventilation seam along the lower section of the frame, a gap no wider than a finger, where sound traveled in a way the architects had not entirely anticipated. Or perhaps they had. Some rooms were built to contain. Others were built so that those who knew where to stand could hear everything. Claire positioned herself 3 feet from the seam and began cleaning the window frame. The meeting opened in Korean. Jiho's voice was lower in register than she expected, unhurried and precise. He did not speak to be heard. He spoke as though the words themselves were under contract. She processed it automatically, the way fluency works after enough years, not as translation but as direct comprehension. He was laying out the foundational terms of the arrangement. A partnership framework, manufacturing rights, regional licensing structures, profit distribution across 3 jurisdictions. The terms were not requests. They were the terms. The language was absolute. Jae-young listened with a focused attention of a man performing attentiveness for an audience, then turned to the Americans. His English was flawless. His tone was collegial, warm, the linguistic equivalent of a handshake. And what he said bore approximately 60% resemblance to what Jiho had actually said. The first deviation was so small that Claire almost didn't catch it. Jiho had said shall. Jae-young said may. In ordinary conversation, the difference would be negligible. In contract language, which was what was being negotiated, the verbal terms that would be transcribed into the document waiting at Jiho's place, shall and may, were not interchangeable. Shall was obligation. May was option. Shall meant the distribution timeline was binding. May meant it was aspirational. Claire's hand slowed on the glass. She waited. Told herself it could be a translation artifact. Some languages carried different weights for those constructions, and even skilled translators made occasional choices. She gave it room to be innocent. Then came the liability clause. Jiho's voice shifted register slightly when he delivered it, a tonal emphasis that in Korean signaled this is the position, not the opening. The liability clause is non-negotiable and absolute. Those were not paraphrased words. She heard each syllable with the precision of someone who had once spent 2 weeks reviewing a similar clause in a similar document and understood exactly what its removal would mean for the party who had fought to keep it. Jae-young turned to the Americans and smiled. He told them that Jiho was signaling flexibility on the liability structure, that he was open to reviewing the Americans' proposed amendments before final language was committed. Claire stopped moving entirely for exactly 2 seconds. Then she resumed because stopping was visible, and visible was the one thing she could not afford to be. But her mind was no longer on the corridor. It had gone to a place she had sealed off very deliberately 2 years ago, the part of her that had once sat in rooms not entirely unlike this one and understood, at a molecular level, the architecture of a contract designed to look like a partnership while functioning as a mechanism of control. She had seen this before. Not this room. Not these men. But this exact methodology, the trusted intermediary, the client who did not speak the language of the other side, the documents that reflected one reality while the verbal negotiations established another. She had seen it deployed once at enormous scale, targeting a consortium of smaller firms who had no reason to doubt the man translating their agreements. She had seen it from the outside. She had been destroyed by the same architecture from the inside, different players, same blueprint. The memory arrived without invitation, a conference room, gray dawn light, her name on a motion she had never filed, a partner she had trusted explaining, with genuine regret in his voice, that the firm's position had become untenable, that they could no longer defend her continued involvement, that the documentation was, unfortunately, quite clear. She had asked to see the documentation. He had said it wasn't appropriate to share it at this stage. She had understood, in that moment, that the documentation did not exist, that what existed was a narrative, carefully assembled by people who had needed her gone and had known exactly which levers to pull. She had fought. For 8 months she had fought with her savings, with her contacts, with every legal mechanism available to someone who had spent a career understanding how those mechanisms worked. She had lost. Not because she was wrong, but because she was outresourced by a network that had been building its case against her for longer than she'd known she had enemies. After the final judgment, she had done the math on what remained. No position would touch her. Her name had been made into a liability. No partner would move with her. The same network had reached all of them. The apartment she could keep for 3 more months. The city she had loved would not survive contact with what she had become inside it. She had left. Rebuilt, if that was the word, into something deliberately smaller. The cleaning job was not irony. It was strategy. You become invisible by doing the invisible work. You survive by being the person no one thinks to check. For 2 years, it had worked. She stood in the corridor outside Suite 14A and listened to Jae-young deliver his 4th consecutive mistranslation, this one regarding the arbitration structure, which Jiho had specified as Korean jurisdiction and Jae-young had rendered as internationally agreed, with final jurisdiction to be determined and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that what was happening inside that room was not a coincidence. This was not one bad actor making careless choices. This was a system, a deliberate, coordinated dismantling of Jiho's contractual position, executed in real time by someone who had earned his seat at the table through years of cultivated trust. The contract, as Jae-young was helping the investors understand it, would give them mechanisms that Jiho had never agreed to. Escape clauses Jiho had never offered. Liability protections Jiho had explicitly refused. And Jiho, speaking a language the investors did not understand, listening to translations he had no reason to doubt, was signing away the structure of his empire sentence by sentence without knowing it. Claire stood at the edge of the corridor and processed the full weight of what she was holding. The information was not hers by choice. She had not come here to do anything except clean glass panels and return to an apartment where no one would ask about her day. She had constructed her invisibility precisely so that nothing would find its way to her. No decisions, no loyalties, no moral weight she hadn't chosen. And yet, through the glass, she watched Jiho listen to Jae-young's latest translation with an expression that had not changed. The mask of a powerful man holding his position, not knowing the ground under it was being quietly removed. She watched the foreign investors relax by small degrees with each exchange. Watched them believe they were winning. Watched Jae-young perform his role with the smooth, unhurried confidence of someone who has done this before and expects to do it again. And she watched Jiho reach, slowly and with absolute certainty, for the pen. 14 seconds. That was how long Claire stood in the service corridor before she moved. It felt longer. It felt like the kind of duration that shouldn't be possible in a moment, the sort of interval where an entire life can be reviewed, weighed, and found insufficient to the size of the decision being requested of it. The pen was in Jiho's hand. She had seen it from the corridor. That single motion, deliberate, unhurried, the motion of a man who signs things with the certainty of someone who has never had reason to doubt the ground under him, had sent something chemical through her body. Not fear exactly. Something more like recognition. She had felt it once before. In a different room, with different principles. She had been on the other side of the glass that time. Not the witness, but the subject. Watching someone she had trusted sign her name into a narrative she had never written. Understanding too late what was happening. Running the calculation of what it would cost her and arriving, nauseous and accurate, at the real number. Everything. It had cost her everything. She pressed her back to the corridor wall. The steel was cold even through her uniform. She could hear the low, modulated rhythm of Jae-young's voice continuing on the other side, unhurried, because he didn't need to hurry. The pen was in Jiho's hand. The investors were nodding. The legal observers were watching tablets. Everything was moving toward completion. She ran the scenarios with the speed of someone who had spent 11 years making decisions under pressure. Scenario 1. She stayed. Did her job. Cleaned the corridor. Left at the end of the shift. The contract was signed. Whatever Jae-young was building for his principals was built. Jiho's empire began its slow, invisible transfer to hands he had never meant to give it to. She went home. Her apartment. Her silence. Her anonymity intact. Scenario 2. She intervened. Crossed the floor. Spoke. Whatever happened next, dismissal, confrontation, the particular danger that came with inserting herself into a room where the most powerful figure was also, by all available intelligence, connected to networks that settled problems in ways that did not involve human resources. She bore the consequence. The calculation was, on its face, simple. Silence was survival. Intervention was exposure. She had built her entire current existence on that equation. She had made peace with it. But there was a third scenario she could not stop running. She had done this before. Not the intervention, the silence. She had stayed quiet when she should have spoken. Not in this room. In a room 3 years before this one, when she had first noticed the anomalies in the documents she was being asked to review. When the pattern had begun to become visible to her. She had flagged it internally. She had been advised, by a mentor she trusted completely, to let it rest, to trust the process, to stay in her lane, to avoid the kind of visibility that came with being the person who named things that powerful people wanted unnamed. She had listened. She had stayed quiet. 3 months later, the same network she had chosen not to expose had used her compliance, her documented review of the very materials she'd stayed silent about, as the foundation of the fraud case built against her. She had been, in the most precise and devastating sense, destroyed by her own restraint. Her father's voice came to her in the corridor, the way it had been coming to her in difficult moments for the past 2 years, not as grief, but as clarity. He had been a structural engineer. He had talked about integrity not as a moral principle, but as a load-bearing reality. Remove it from a structure, and the structure does not weaken. It fails. Quietly at first. Then all at once. Jae-young was the removed integrity, and Jiho was the structure that didn't know it. She pushed off the wall. She took her cleaning cloth. She took the caddy. She moved into Suite 14A through the service access, a function of her clearance, a practicality of her role, and she moved to the far corner of the room, began working the baseboards there, 2/3 of the way to the table. She kept her head down, kept her rhythm, stayed in the register of background. No one looked at her. She moved again, closer. The fiction of her purpose holding, a cleaner finding her way systematically around a room. She reached the secondary station 3 feet from the table's end. She could now hear Jiho's breathing. She could see, in peripheral vision, the legal observers tracking the document. She could see Jae-young's hand gesture to the investors, a small, contained signal that said, "Almost there." Jiho lifted the pen, positioned it over the signature line. Claire moved. Not fast. Not urgently. She moved with the controlled casualness of someone performing a task, reaching toward a surface near Jiho's position, the way cleaners do, the way invisible people do. And in the 2 seconds of proximity that this motion created, she leaned close to him, her gloved hand angled toward her face, and she spoke. Not in English. In Korean. Quietly. Precisely. The way you say something when you know you have exactly one opportunity, and you cannot afford to waste a syllable. Don't sign that contract. Jiho's pen stopped. He is lying to you. The translator. Every clause you stated as absolute, he rendered as negotiable. The liability protection you refused to waive, he told them you'd reconsider it. This contract, as they understand it, is not the contract you agreed to. She stepped back, resumed her rhythm, kept moving. For 3 seconds, nothing in the room changed. Then Jiho set the pen down. It was a small motion. Deliberate. Final. He placed it precisely parallel to the edge of the document, in the manner of someone who has made a decision and is in no hurry for the room to understand what that decision is. Jae-young noticed. She could see it in the micro-change of his expression, the slight tightening around the eyes, the quarter-second recalibration of his smile. He redirected smoothly, asking whether Ji-ho wanted to review a particular section before signing. Ji-ho did not respond to him. He looked very carefully at nothing in particular. The middle distance. The particular focus of a man turning something over in an interior space where no one else had access. The investors exchanged a look. The legal observers stopped typing. The room had changed pressure. Everyone in it could feel it, even if no one could name it. Claire reached the far side of the room, kept working. Her pulse was extraordinary. She kept her face blank and her hands steady and thought of nothing except the next surface and the next motion and the absolute requirement that her body continue performing a task it had been performing for 4 months with complete professional consistency. Ji-ho turned his head. Not toward her. Not yet. He turned toward his 2 security personnel, who stood against the far wall in the posture of professionals waiting to be needed. He said 4 words in Korean. Quiet. Absolute. The same register he used for contract terms. Lock the doors. The doors locked. The sound of the mechanism, a clean, electronic certainty, landed differently on different people in the room. The investors looked up. The legal observers exchanged a glance. Jae-young maintained his expression with the precision of a man who is trained for situations that require maintaining expressions, but something in the distribution of his weight shifted. Claire did not move. Ji-ho remained seated for another moment. He looked at the contract folder. He looked at his pen, still resting parallel to the document's edge. Then he looked at Jae-young. When he spoke, it was in English. Flawless, unhurried. The diction of someone educated across multiple systems. The vocabulary of a man who read contracts in the language they were written in rather than the language they were translated into. Gentlemen, he said to the investors, I want to make certain we have a shared understanding of what I agreed to this evening, so there are no surprises once counsel reviews the document. The investors looked at each other, then at Jae-young, then back at Ji-ho. One of them said carefully, Of course. The liability clause in Section 4, Ji-ho said. I stated, in this room, this evening, that it was non-negotiable and absolute. I used those precise words. What was communicated to you? A silence that answered before any words did. The other investor said, We were told you were open to reviewing the language. That amendments were. I was not, Ji-ho said. Quietly. Absolutely. The same register as the contract terms themselves. The room recalibrated in real time. Claire watched it happen from the periphery. The investors processing what this meant, the legal observers beginning to page back through their notes, Jae-young opening his mouth, and then making the professional calculation to close it again. Ji-ho turned to him. Jae-young, he said. And nothing else. Just the name. In English. The way a name can be the entirety of an accusation. Jae-young produced a response, a smooth, immediate pivot toward clarification, the language of a man recasting a gap as a misunderstanding, reaching for the vocabulary of good faith and professional interpretation. Claire had to grant him, extraordinarily good at this. His voice carried no panic. His explanation landed as entirely plausible in the first 3 seconds. Ji-ho let him finish. Then he picked up the contract document and turned to the first page. Section 2, Paragraph 3, he said. The distribution timeline. I use the word shall. Binding obligation. What language appears in this document? Jae-young said. The language reflects the spirit of. What word appears in this document? Not a question. Not an invitation to continue. One of the legal observers had opened the document on their tablet. Their face had gone the color of someone finding something they were not expecting to find. May, the observer said, almost inaudibly. Ji-ho turned another page. The arbitration structure. Korean jurisdiction, exclusively final. What does this document specify? The observer's voice was even quieter this time. International arbitration. Jurisdiction to be mutually agreed. The silence that followed had weight. It was not the silence of a room where nothing was happening. It was the silence of a room where everyone was watching something they had not anticipated, understanding simultaneously what it meant and what it was going to cost. Ji-ho set the document down. He looked at Jae-young for a long moment. Every term I considered foundational, he said, appears in this document in a form I never agreed to. Every protection I stated as absolute appears as optional. Every jurisdiction I specified as mine appears as shared or unresolved. This is not a translation error. This is a document that describes a different negotiation from the one that took place in this room. Jae-young had run out of vocabulary. The machinery of his composure was still running, but it was running without purchase, the smooth spin of gears that had lost their teeth. He said, "I can explain the methodology." "You explained it," Ji-ho said, as it was happening. "I heard the explanation in real time. I understood every word you said to them. I have understood English for 23 years. The moment landed like something physical. The investors processed it first. The realization that the man they had been told did not speak English had been listening, with complete comprehension, to everything Jae-young had told them, every reassurance, every softened translation, every promise of flexibility. He had been watching his own trust be used as a weapon against him by someone he had trusted implicitly. And he had said nothing, because he had wanted to understand the full architecture before he named it. "I engaged a translator I did not need," Ji-ho said, "because he came with 12 years of demonstrated loyalty, and the value of a trusted intermediary in international negotiations is not linguistic. It is relational. It is the assurance that what passes between parties is accurate and uncorrupted." He looked at Jae-young with an expression that Clare, from 15 feet away, absorbed as confirmation of everything she had ever heard about Ji-ho's particular brand of consequence. "He was not a translator," Ji-ho said. "He was an operative. The question I now have is, for whom?" Ji-ho's security moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this instruction. Jae-young was guided, firmly, professionally, in the way that left no room for misunderstanding the direction, away from the table and toward the door he would not be exiting through on his own terms. He did not make a scene. She noted this with the clinical attention she gave to the behavior of people who were calculated enough to still be calculating even at their worst moment. He understood that making a scene would be more costly than not making one. He was, to the end, a professional. His eyes moved, once, across the room as he was guided out. They found Clare. She did not look away. She met them with the same stillness she'd maintained for the last 40 minutes and let him read whatever he needed to read there. He was gone before the door closed. The investors were escorted to a secondary room, politely, firmly, with the assurance that legal counsel would be available to them shortly. The legal observers followed. The room emptied with a swiftness that had the quality of choreography, until it was just Clare and Ji-ho. He had not moved from his chair. He sat with a contract document closed in front of him and his hands flat on the table, and he regarded her with the unhurried attention of a man who had just discovered that something he thought he understood about this room was incorrect. She waited. She had learned in the past 2 years the discipline of waiting, of not filling silence because silence made you nervous. "You speak Korean," he said. Not a question. "Yes." Fluently. Fluently enough to hear what he was doing. Ji-ho looked at her for another long moment. Then at her uniform, her gloves, the cleaning caddy still resting in her left hand out of professional habit. "You understood the contract terms. Not just the language, the implications." "Yes. That is not a cleaner's knowledge." She said nothing to that. It was accurate, and she saw no purpose in contesting it. He leaned forward just slightly. The motion of a man narrowing a distance. "The network behind Jae-young," he said, "has been attempting to gain access to specific elements of my organization's structure for 4 years. They have made 3 previous attempts through various intermediaries. Each time, I identified the vector and closed it. This was the most sophisticated attempt. It required a trusted internal actor." He paused. "It also required an external actor to carry the operational risk." Claire's pulse was very controlled. She was listening with the part of her that had spent 11 years in corporate risk analysis and had not stopped functioning simply because it had been stripped of its title and its office. "The network that embedded Jae-young," Ji-ho continued, "is the same network that has been systematically targeting mid-tier financial infrastructure across 3 Pacific markets for 6 years. They do not use crude methods. They use trusted people. They find the individuals with established credibility and they turn them, or they build those individuals from the ground up. He looked at her steadily. 7 years ago, a risk analyst at a major Seoul-affiliated financial firm identified what appeared to be a coordinated shell company structure being used to route fraudulent liability across international jurisdictions. She filed an internal report. Her report was redirected. 6 months later, she was the subject of a professional misconduct investigation built on fabricated documentation. 2 years later, she was professionally destroyed. Claire said nothing. Her face said nothing. But something behind her sternum tightened with the force of confirmation. Her name was Clare Johnson, Ji-ho said. She held his gaze. Let the silence be what it was. The same network, he said, that destroyed you, did this. And then, with the quality of someone asking a question to which they already suspect the answer, but require it spoken aloud. Who are you really? She told him everything. Not because she had decided to trust him. Trust was a structural element she had learned to treat with the same caution she once applied to contract language. But because she was sitting in a locked room with one of the most powerful and connected men in the Pacific financial world, he had just demonstrated that he already knew significant parts of her story, and the calculation of partial disclosure versus full disclosure had, in the context of this specific room, only one defensible answer. She told him about the report she had filed. The internal redirection. The 6 months she had watched the matter disappear into procedural silence while continuing to do her job and trust the institutions she had built her career inside. She told him about the investigation, the specific mechanism by which her own documented work had been reconfigured as evidence of her complicity rather than her diligence. She told him about the legal process, the mounting costs, the partners who had quietly and apologetically stepped back, the hearing where the documentation presented against her bore her name and her analytical methodology, but described conclusions she had never reached and actions she had never taken. She told him about the 2 years, the deliberate reduction, the process of becoming someone no one would look for. Ji-ho listened without interrupting. This was, she observed, his primary mode of information gathering, total, weaponized attention. He did not take notes. He did not signal response. He received. When she finished, the room was very quiet. The report you filed, he said. The shell company structure you identified, describe it. She described it. The methodology. The jurisdictions. The specific mechanism of liability routing that had caught her attention. Something shifted in Ji-ho's expression, not dramatically, not in the way that lesser men would allow, but perceptibly. A recognition. I know that structure, he said. Not as an abstraction. I encountered it in a due diligence review 18 months ago. I brought it to 3 separate legal teams. All 3 teams found it clean. They would, Claire said. It was built to survive standard review. The liability misdirection only becomes visible if you're looking at transaction timing across jurisdictions simultaneously, not sequentially. Most review processes are sequential by design. It's not a flaw in the review methodology, it's an exploitation of it. Ji-ho was quiet for a moment. You identified this 7 years ago. I identified it. I reported it. It was used to destroy me. He stood, moved to the room's communication panel, and made 2 calls. The calls were brief and precise, the calls of someone who maintains teams for exactly this category of situation. Within 40 minutes, 3 of his senior investigators were in the room with them, and Claire was walking them through the architecture of what she had found 7 years ago with the clarity of someone who had spent 2 years with nothing to do but replay it. The investigators were good. She had worked with good investigators and bad ones, and she could tell within minutes. They asked the right questions. They didn't ask questions they already knew the answers to. They cross-referenced as she spoke, pulling document threads that connected to other document threads, building the kind of picture that only becomes visible when multiple independent datasets are allowed to talk to each other. By 2 a.m., the room had accumulated evidence. Not just the evidence of tonight, not just Jae-young's documented mistranslations, recoverable now from the session recording that Suite 14A had, as a matter of facility protocol, been making the entire time, but the broader architecture. The network Clare had identified 7 years ago. The same structural fingerprints appearing again in the Jae-young operation. The same jurisdictional routing patterns. The same methodology of using trusted insiders to create the access point and then building outward from that access with documentation that survived casual review. It was, the lead investigator said quietly, reviewing the assembled picture, the same organization. The network that had destroyed Clare Johnson had been the same network attempting to capture Ji-ho Lim's empire tonight. They have a pattern, Clare said. They identify people with specific analytical capabilities who have found parts of the structure. They don't eliminate those people that would create the kind of attention that suits their methodology. They discredit them. They make their knowledge worthless by making the person holding it worthless. They've done it at least 6 times that I can document. She looked at the network map that had taken shape on the room's digital board. Including me. Ji-ho stood before the board for a long time. Then he turned. His lead legal counsel had arrived, a woman of approximately 60 with the bearing of someone who had been in impossible rooms before and considered them professionally routine. Ji-ho gestured toward the assembled evidence and said 6 words. I want it cleared. All of it. His counsel looked at the board, at Clare, at the documented timeline. It can be done, she said. It won't be fast. It doesn't need to be fast, Ji-ho said. It needs to be complete. 3 months later, the clearing was complete. The misconduct findings against Clare Johnson were formally vacated, not through a quiet administrative revision, but through a documented reinvestigation that named the specific mechanism of fabrication and the specific parties responsible. The professional misconduct record was not sealed. It was corrected, which was a different thing. A correction did not make her unfindable. It made her findable in the right way, with the right annotation. The network was named. Not fully dismantled. These things didn't dismantle in 3 months, and anyone who told you otherwise was either naive or selling something, but named, mapped, and made visible to the appropriate parties in 3 jurisdictions who had been independently developing their own partial pictures. Clare's evidence was the connective tissue, the piece that turned several isolated investigations into a single coherent one. Jae-young cooperated. This surprised no one who understood the calculus of men like Jae-young. They did not carry loyalty as a terminal value. They carried it instrumentally, and when the instrument lost its utility, they recalibrated. He provided names, dates, operational details that corroborated and extended the documentary evidence. The investors, it emerged, had not been witting participants in the scheme. They had been a vehicle, sophisticated, credible, and completely unaware that the translator who had been arranged for their use by their regional partner was not working for the deal, but against the man on the other side of it. They were cooperative, embarrassed, and relieved to be on the right side of the documentation. Ji-ho called Clare into his offices on the 4th Thursday of the 3rd month. His offices were nothing like the negotiation suite. They were warmer, paradoxically, less deliberately imposing. The kind of space that belonged to someone who had stopped needing to use rooms to communicate power. He said, I have a position I have not been able to fill. She waited. Head of International Negotiation Risk. The function includes pre-deal intelligence review, translator and intermediary vetting, contractual language auditing across jurisdictions, and real-time advisory capacity during active negotiations. He paused. The last person in this role I trusted completely. The trust was misplaced. Clare processed the offer with the careful, complete attention it deserved. I'm not offering you protection, Ji-ho said, and she understood that he had read her well enough to know this was the assurance that mattered. I'm offering you position. The work is real. The authority is real. The risk is real. I don't protect people. I give capable people the conditions in which to be effective. And in exchange? In exchange, I have someone in the room who hears what I hear, who understands what I understand, who cannot be turned because they have already survived what turning looks like from the inside. She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the corridor, the cold steel at her back, the 14 seconds she had stood there running scenarios and finding, at the end of all of them, that there was only one she could live inside. She thought about her father, about structures. about what it costs and what it means to be the person who refuses to be the compromised joint. She thought about a gloved hand wiping glass that was already clean, in a room where she was not supposed to understand anything. Yes, she said. The first negotiation she attended in her new capacity was 3 weeks later, a cross-jurisdictional licensing agreement with a European consortium. The room was different from Suite 14A, warmer light. Circular table rather than rectangular. A culture that negotiated horizontally rather than across from each other. Claire sat at the table. Not at the wall. Not at the periphery. At the table, in the seat Jiho's counsel had designated for advisory capacity, with a copy of the preliminary contract terms that she had already annotated in 2 places the previous evening. She was not wearing gloves. She was not wearing a uniform. She wore a dark blazer and the particular expression of someone who has survived having everything taken from them and discovered, in the survival, exactly how much they were worth. When the lead negotiator for the European side introduced their proposed amendment to Section 7, Claire spoke. Not loudly. Not performatively. With the exact register of someone who has spent 11 years learning how language is used and 2 years learning what it costs when it is used against you. She spoke. And the room listened. Not because she was the most powerful person at the table, but because she was, without question, the most necessary one. She had spent 2 years learning to be invisible. She had spent 1 night deciding it was finished. She thought staying invisible would keep her alive. But in the end, the truth didn't need permission. It only needed courage. If you believe silence protects lies, and courage destroys them, like, subscribe and share. Because sometimes the most powerful voice in the room belongs to the person no one was watching.